Welcome to the Tech Talks Daily Podcast, where you can learn and be inspired by real-world examples of how technology is transforming businesses and reshaping industries in a language everyone can understand. Here is your host, Neil C. Hughes.
Welcome back to the Tech Talks Daily Podcast. Now, on this Daily Tech Podcast, I'm passionate about hearing about stories from all over the world around how technology is making a difference and how entire nations are adapting and evolving with technological change and turning disruption into opportunity. And I want to hear about how education is changing, startup communities are thriving, and how governments are finally keeping up with the pace of technological change. So, wherever you are listening to me today, this is your true calling to help me help put where you live on the map. And today, I want to put Ireland on my tech map because I want to learn how Ireland is addressing the AI skills gap and talk about tech talent in Ireland, government investment in AI, and how actually Ireland is being one of the first to offer a master's degree in AI. And for all those reasons, I'm excited to invite Shane Nolan, SVP of Technology, Consumer and Business Services at IDA Ireland, onto the podcast. And as more and more companies look to capitalise on AI technologies for their data-driven decision-making, Shane is also going to discuss how the use of AI has evolved over the years and how AI as a service is now being utilised. And he's going to demonstrate the potential benefits and risks that artificial intelligence as a service has for businesses and how it's spreading to more industry sectors at an incredible rate. So buckle up and hold on tight so I can beam your ears all the way to Ireland, where Shane is waiting to speak with us now. So a massive warm welcome to the show, Shane. Can you tell the listeners a little more about who you are and what you do?
Super. Thanks, Neil. And nice to chat to you today. So my name is Shane Nolan and I lead the technology team at IDA Ireland, which is the Irish government's inward investment agency. So IDA Ireland works with companies all the way from Tokyo to San Francisco to basically help them to leverage Ireland to internationalize their business and scale their teams. In that work, we're very grateful to count some of the world's most prominent tech and digital brands as our clients. So we work with folks like Apple, Microsoft, Salesforce, Facebook, Twitter, SAP, TikTok, Amazon, and closer to home, folks like Zalando. These collectively employ tens of thousands of people in Ireland, which is the real objective for what we do.
I always say on this podcast that technology works best when it brings people together, and it sounds like you guys are doing just that, and how you're working with so many big cities throughout the world with technology at the heart of it all. But I've got to ask, can you remember where your love of technology originally came from and what put you on the path that you're on today?
Yeah, sure. And I was pretty fortunate because when I left college, it kind of happened around the same time as telecoms was deregulating in Ireland. So we had all these new entrants coming into the country looking for folks to staff up their teams. And because it was a tech or a telecoms monopoly before that, there weren't too many folks that they could hire that were experienced. So great training. I joined a telco startup, which ultimately was acquired by BT. And I think that the training kind of demystified technology for me because I wouldn't have been, a huge computer science expert when I was in college. It all just seemed a little bit esoteric to me. So with good training, it kind of demystified tech and, just told me that I could really kind of learn anything and you could be, you could understand tech by being an autodidact. And it started me on a 20-year journey of very pleasant learning about tech.
And I'm curious, on that 20-year journey, have you seen the use of technology and specifically artificial intelligence? Have you seen that evolve over the years?
Yeah, like in Ireland, you may know, like we were the kind of location of choice for a lot of US software companies in particular since the mid-'80s. And I think, pretty mid to late 90s onwards, we were starting to see the use of computational linguistics or natural language processing in localization, really to, I suppose, drive down cost, because it was a cost of internationalizing for a lot of software companies, having to translate both the actual application and the support materials into lots of different languages, and essentially turning localization into an editorial activity as opposed to manual translation. So that was happening in Ireland probably late 90s, early 2000s. And, kind of following that and leveraging the fact that we had this bank of capability in natural language processing, we started seeing activity, particularly in financial services, around insurance and also around fraud and risk management. And people like Aon, Accenture and others building machine learning teams in Ireland to model risk on the insurance side, and then to identify fraudulent behavior in the payments and fintech side. And that kind of brought us up to, around 2010, 11, 12. And really around that time, we just started to see things take off. I think, deep learning or neural networks started to become the kind of dominant framework for AI. And that was happening around the same time as, advances in, processor and GPU technology was making the compute power very, very accessible. So since then, we've kind of seen AI become a lot more mainstream, because the barriers to entry have fallen. And, in the mainstream of AI, we've seen, mid and back office operations in Ireland in particular really embrace AI through automation and cognitive workflow through technologies like RPA. And more recently, we've seen this really be embraced in the customer support industry through deployment of chatbots and digital assistants for agents. So yeah, really over a kind of 20-year period almost, AI turned into a thing that was, or machine learning turned into a thing that was purely used by the localization community, into things that are now being used by back office operations, led by folks from the accounting professions.
And on this Daily Tech podcast, I am passionate about sharing stories from all over the world and learning how each country is adapting to technological change. So when I recently read how Ireland is the first to offer a master's degree in artificial intelligence, I had to get you on the podcast today. But can you expand on how Ireland is addressing the AI skills gap? Because it is such a big topic right now, isn't it?
Yeah, hugely. It's a global war for AI talent at the moment. And I suppose in Ireland, we've understood the importance of having relevant third and fourth level graduates for economic development for a long, long time. And it was probably one of the drivers for the government at the time introducing free third level education in Ireland in 1996. Sadly, I was finishing college at the time, but it's been a game changer in terms of the level of third level attainment in Ireland and how that's supported economic growth. But we found in the meantime that there's also a need for a kind of reactive and nimble agency to provide and facilitate workforce learning. So having good third and fourth level education is table stakes. But I think at the moment, just given the pace of change in technology, countries need an agency to support and facilitate workforce learning, as I was saying. In Ireland, this agency is called SkillNets. And we work with them closely, I suppose, in late 2016 and early 2017, along with companies like Accenture, Analog Devices, Citibank, GM, Google, IBM, Microsoft, and Zalando to shape the curriculum that essentially became the Masters in AI. And it was launched by the University of Limerick in January 2018. And, since then, all of the top 10 universities and colleges in Ireland offer Masters programs in AI. And I think the skill sets model in Ireland is really interesting because it pools demand for business or from business, and it facilitates curriculum development to meet this demand, and then essentially tenders for colleges or universities to deliver the course. So, you can get from a blank sheet of paper or an industry ask for a particular skill set to having student intake within 6 months. So it's a really, really quick way to develop curriculum.
And in the world of business, I think it's hard to remember a time where we weren't talking about software as a service and cloud technology. But one thing that we're starting to see more and more of is AI as a service. And for people that have not come across this before, can you tell me more about how AI as a service, what it is, and how it's being utilised at the moment?
Sure. So I suppose at a basic level, it's access to machine learning services and associated computer power or compute power on an as-needed basis without the need to develop software tools in-house or indeed find the scarce skills to do so or buy expensive hardware to run these tools on. So essentially, AI as a service removes the main barriers that have prevented widespread adoption of AI and machine learning, which is, lack of deep math and computer science capability within an organization to develop these models from the ground up, and then the sheer cost of building the infrastructure to run these models. And access to enough data to train the models properly. So AI as a service removes all of those barriers and essentially gives you access to AI algorithms, in many cases designed for your industry, and the computing infrastructure that they run on a rental basis.
And if we have a non-techie business leader or decision maker listening to our conversation today, what are the biggest potential benefits that come with AI as a service?
Yeah, I think that the biggest benefit is it just opens up the potential of AI to any organization, big or small. The top benefit is cost. You don't need to buy hundreds or thousands of GPU-based servers to run your machine learning models on. You only pay for what you use and when you use it. And I think, accessibility is another big advantage because, a lot of the machine learning and AI models and algorithms, as I said, have been pre-developed for specific markets or specific verticals. And there's a growing availability of what's called no-code AI tools, which are essentially drag and drop software packages where you don't need to be a Python expert to program the algorithms. Essentially, you can create your rhythms through a kind of graphical user interface. So really, it makes this kind of esoteric technology available to any organization, irrespective of their size. In terms of risks, it's probably twofold. I think security is probably one that a lot of companies thinking about embracing AI as a service need to think about, because you'll be transiting, storing, and processing your data off-site, and you need to make sure you have the necessary levels of production or protection rather designed into the solution at each level. And the second risk, although it's probably becoming less of a risk with the advent of explainable AI and recent policy moves, but the second risk is transparency. Do you know how the off-the-shelf AI models work, for example? And given there's a big move in the US and the EU now around trustworthy AI, can you stand over the output of those models in terms of them being fair and not having bias?
And I'm curious, who are the top players in the AI as a service industry already, and which industries do you think are most likely to adopt it? Are you seeing any patterns there?
Yeah, definitely. And I think in terms of players, the ones I'm probably most familiar with are the ones with, significant regional infrastructure and engineering teams in Ireland. And they're the main public cloud providers like AWS, Microsoft Azure, Google AI Platform, and IBM Watson, all who have, significant infrastructure footprint in Ireland, and indeed, large engineering teams like AWS probably have north of 2,000 engineers in Dublin. So we're pretty familiar with their offering from an AI perspective. In terms of industries most likely to adopt AI as a service, I think there'll probably be two main cohorts. I think firstly, it'll be those industries that are data intensive, but don't have the deep traditional or ML or computer science capabilities in-house. And we've seen examples of this, in terms of the collaboration between the Novartis team in Dublin, Novartis, the life sciences company, and Microsoft, who are working together on development of personalized medicines like cell and gene therapy, sitting on top of the Microsoft Azure AI offering. And then the second cohort, I think, is going to be, startups that can use AI as a service to develop and deploy scale without needing massive funding rounds to do so. And a good example of this would be a Dublin startup called Parley, which is a conversational AI platform which leverages the AWS AI service suite to develop chatbots that are used by most of the European airlines at the moment, like Ryanair and Malta Airlines.
Incredibly cool. And I suppose this is the point of the podcast where I'm going to ask you to gaze into your virtual crystal ball. And do you have any predictions for how AI will continue to revolutionise businesses as we move forward?
Yeah, and I kind of touched on this already. Like, I think the accessibility trend that's typified by AI as a service will continue, I think, through further growth and popularity of no-code AI tools. Like, I think, enabling folks who don't have a computer science or AI background to, deploy AI models to understand more about their business and their customers, I think is going to become really, really important and quite common, I think, over the next 5 years. I think, in terms of, the who's who of no-code AI tools, Data Robot out of Boston are probably the most high-profile company in this space. But there's been some really interesting companies emerging over the past 2 years that have done, seed rounds that have stood out. A company called Obviously.ai being a case in point, who did a seed round earlier this year and basically had the who's who of Silicon Valley investors as being part of that round, which is quite unique for a seed round. Primer, again, out of San Francisco, another one to watch. A company that has predominantly provided services to government agencies has now pivoted into a no-code AI tools provider. I think as well, another trend that's going to happen is the continued automation of routine tasks in both front and back office, supported by AI and robotic process automation tools. I think, you will continue to see what sometimes is seen as, I suppose, a corny prediction, but the robot will be taken out of many jobs and the kind of routine, repetitive things will be done by automated tools, leaving folks in those jobs to do the more heterogeneous aspects of the job, and certainly the more interactive parts of the job. We see the same things happening in, customer support or contact center roles, where chatbots will be doing a lot of the heavy lifting on customer conversations, and indeed generationally a lot of customers, certainly in the kind of 18 to 34-year-old bracket, prefer to engage with chatbots in many cases if the chatbot enables them to get to the answers that they're looking for. I think another big trend would be governance, particularly AI governance and explainable AI. I think these will be big topics for business using the technology, particularly this year, but certainly over the next 5 years. Like, I think there was always a high likelihood that governance and governance oversights and regulation would be part and parcel of AI. But I think recent regulations and policy updates released last month by the European Commission and the FTC in the US, respectively, are going to fast track adoption of these, governance approaches. Like, I think coincidentally, the EU legal framework and an update from the US FTC came out in the same week last April, setting, I suppose, the scene for where AI regulation is going to go in the United States and Europe. And both are broadly similar in direction. But I was struck by one part of the FTC publication, which essentially was a blog post where they said, keep in mind that if you don't hold yourself accountable, the FTC may do it for you. So I think FTC certainly putting a shot across the bows for US developers and users of AI, but very much same overall direction as the European Commission in terms of regulation. I think one area, maybe this isn't one that will impact business straight away, but certainly an area to keep an eye on in 2021 and probably going into 2022 is quantum AI. I think that the exponential increase in available compute power and quantum AI has the potential to revolutionize it, both in terms of the speed that algorithms can be processed, but also the opportunities that generative AI can bring because of quantitative power or quantum power rather. So I think that the release over the past kind of year and a half of open source modeling and training frameworks for machine learning and indeed deep learning by the leading players in quantum. Google TensorFlow being a case in point, but also Azure Quantum and AWS Bracket offer kind of software development kit type offerings for quantum AI. So again, it's making quantum AI accessible. It's offering layers of abstraction where you don't need to be a quantum scientist to deploy and train models in a quantum computing environment. And just think, just the increase in compute power there is going to enable AI to do things that we couldn't have dreamt of even last year.
I completely agree with you there. And we do currently have listeners in 165 different countries, I think. And that's one of the reasons I'm so passionate about getting every guest to put where they're talking to us from today on the map, especially outside of Silicon Valley. So for that global audience, what is it that you think makes Ireland such a great base for these top tech AI providers right now?
Yeah, I think it's access to skills all day long. I think if you took skills out of the Ireland offering for AI, it would really undermine our attractiveness. And I think it's, we touched on this earlier, Neil, it's a global war for talent in AI at the moment, and the countries who can either generate and attract the right level of skills will be the ones that succeed. Like there was a recent LinkedIn report on AI talent in Europe, which pointed that Ireland has the highest concentration of AI talent. So per capita, we have more AI trained folks than any other location in Europe, and this is driven by a combination of academic output, which is vitally important, vocational training, and post-grad training that we touched on earlier, but also inbound migration. And I think for countries to excel as locations for AI, they need to be attractive to mobile talent as well. And in Ireland, 17% of the workforce here wasn't born here. And being a relatively small country, with finite academic output from the education system, inbound migration always has to be part of the equation. And we put a lot of effort into marketing the country to foreign skilled talent, but also making the immigration experience welcoming for that talent as well, which is vitally important. I think in addition to access to skills, track record is an important one, and the Irish government spends about 800 million euros a year supporting research and development, which is a pretty big commitment for a country of a little under 5 million people. And as part of this, they've been investing in academic research in AI for a long time, back when it was research in constraints programming right through to advanced analytics, to modern day machine and deep learning, and more recently, investment in applied quantum computing research. I think for Ireland as well, it helps that most of the big AI as a service platforms have significant infrastructure here. Like it's probably the largest AWS and Azure data center cluster in Europe. And I think proximity to the infrastructure as AI evolves is going to become more and more important. And finally, I think that the startup scene in Ireland is buzzing at the moment. We have a very, very strong startup scene in AI and machine learning. And, it helps that the largest seed fund in Europe is an Irish government agency called Enterprise Ireland that do roughly 100 seed deals a year. So by deal volume, they're ahead of any other seed investor in Europe. And I think the quality of the AI startup scene here is exemplified through the amount of M&A activity. So we've had recent acquisitions of the likes of Movidius, Voices, and Artomatics by Intel, Apple, and Unity, respectively.
I think it's inspirational, the work that you're doing there, and especially the approach that you've got. There was like a proactive approach rather than a reactive approach for technological disruption and how you're leading the way. I'd love to see where this journey takes you all, and Ireland too. But a question I always like to ask my guests before I let them go is, ask them if there's a song that has inspired them on their career or helps them get their head in the zone before going on stage, or just reminds them of their life in tech. So if I was to throw that one at you, what would your song be and why?
Sure. Well, I might start with an album and then narrow it down to a song, if that's okay. So I remember when I started college, a friend of mine gave me a copy of Loveless by My Bloody Valentine, and just after it came out, and I remember listening to it, and it blew my mind that this sound could come from guitar, bass, drums, and vocals, and throughout college it became my kind of late night cramming soundtrack, and now probably 30 years later, if I'm working late or if I have to pull an all-nighter for something, it's still the album I listen to. So, if you were to put me on the spot and say, pick a song from that album, I'd have to say Sometimes, which you probably remember from the film Lost in Translation as well. I thought it was used to very good effect on that film.
Wow, what a fantastic choice. That will have pride of place on our Spotify playlist. And finally, before you go, can you remind everyone listening of where they can find out any information about IDA Ireland, the work you're doing, and even contact your team if they're left with any questions?
Sure, yeah. So, I think everything you want to know about investing in Ireland and indeed the tech scene here is available from www.idaireland.com. And if folks have specific questions, they can mail me at shane.nolan@ida.ie or DM me on Twitter at NolanSHA.
Well, there's so much I've loved chatting with you about today. What really stands out for me is how Ireland is addressing this AI skills gap and talking about the overall tech talent in Ireland, the startup community there, the government investment in AI, and how Ireland also being one of the first to offer a master's degree in artificial intelligence. Incredibly cool, incredibly inspiring. So thank you for sharing that with us all today, Shane.
My pleasure, Neil. Nice chatting with you.
For me, there were just so many inspiring stories of how Ireland is embracing technology, addressing the AI skills gap, has an incredibly exciting startup scene and is thriving as a result. So I cannot thank Shane enough for sharing that story with me today. And over to you though, wherever you're listening, please let me help you put where you live on the map. And it's nice and easy. All you need to do is send me a quick email, techblogwriter@outlook.com, LinkedIn, Instagram, Twitter @NeilCHughes. And my website is techblogwriter.co.uk. So that is your true calling. Send me a message. And yes, technology does work best when it brings us all together. So a big thank you for listening as always. And until next time, don't be a stranger.
Thank you for listening to the Tech Talks Daily Podcast with Neil C. Hughes. Remember, technology works best when it brings people together.